Hello chess friends, this is Videmaster Valerianov, and in my lecture now, I'll share with you a game that was played by Robert James Fischer, one of the greatest American chess players and chess champions at all time, and the master Anthony Sadie. The game was played in the United States Championship in New York in 1964, and in my opinion, this game really makes impression of the style of Fischer and how he was able to literally to run over his opponents. So Fischer was having the black pieces here, and Grandmaster Sadie had white. White started with the move of c4, and then black just played c5. Knight f3, knight c6, d4, and then after c takes to d4, knight takes to d4. Black decided to move on with knight up to f6. Okay, so this type of variation is really interesting. See, probably you remember the famous game between Anthony Sadie and Fischer, where Fischer played the interesting variation of known as the Fischer Gambit. But this game is also quite interesting in order to see how we can practically utilize powerful threats and activities, even if the position is not so complicated, not so tactical. After knight f6 and knight c3, black simply used a6. The development is simple. With the move of e6, black is also preparing the way of his dark square bishop to come over to b4 and do some things. If white decides to play e4, we can see that a move like bishop b4 will really put white in kind of danger. First, his knight on c3 will be pinned, and secondly, his pawn on e4 will be kind of hit. So therefore, after moving up with e6, white decided to play knight d to b5 in order to prevent some moves like these, and now forcing or at least provoking black to move his pawn on d6, which will mean that the bishop will be close on f8. Of course, a player from Fischer's range can never be forced to play passively. The move of bishop b4 is interesting. Now, if white comes up with knight d6 with a check, which seems quite nice, then black is even getting ready to play king e7. But as a compensation, he'll receive the powerful c line, and of course the king will have a very easy free way to go back to the actual area where he wants to, with a artificial castling. After rook e8, king f8, and g8, of course black will be having his king on a safe spot, and furthermore he can play d5, break through the position, and it will seem that white will be even less developed than anything that black did with his two lost tempos of his king. In any case, white did not gave up that check. I think that giving up the check on the d6 square seems interesting, but well, after a3, black decided to capture the knight at c3, bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop, and then black came up with the move of pawn to d5. Of course, this breakthrough is really simple. In case of the move of d5, white has decided already to play e3, just to stabilize, but we see that in every game of Fischer that you can just look at, you can see something tremendous. In every game that he plays, this man is actually developing his ideas always on purpose, and most importantly, not just this, but also he's developing them very actively, and so that in this case they can be playing the major role, and they can be connected to the actual promotion of the threats or whatever he has decided to make. So after playing the move of e3, black decided to castle on the short side, and after c takes to d5, e takes to d5, bishop e2, and bishop up to f5 from black, all of the black pieces are completely developed, and he's ready to really complete his development with queen d7, and rook a to d8, and rook f to e8. That's what we call an active development. One of the things that we have to understand about the development is that any time when we manage to develop faster and more actively than the opponent, we get possibilities. The possibilities usually lead to different ideas. After playing the bishop on the f5 square, black is having the actual control of the whole h7 to d1 diagonal, and it's all good. Black can be playing rook e8, queen d7, rook a to d8, and all of this would work well. White's bishop on c1 is completely cramped out there, and we see that for difference than black, white is unfortunately having most of his pieces really passive. So white decided to make right now knight at the b5, just relying on the transfer of the knight at d4. But then black simply played queen b6, connecting the two rooks. Now black is completely set, and he is going to maneuver around and search for ways to bring his own knight up to e4. Maybe the knight from c6 can come over to e5 as well, and different things. White castled, okay, and then black did a6, attacking that knight. Knight d4 and knight takes to d4. You see, Fischer also follows the rule that anytime when we see pieces in our opponent's pieces in our territory, in our middle of the board, we have to try and find a way to attack on them. By playing the move of a6, black is neutralizing the white knight so that it goes away, and when that happens, of course, white's troubles actually start. Knight takes knight, queen takes knight. Well, what about the exchange? In the exchange, we know that white has a pair of bishops. Wouldn't that be sufficient enough for him to have at least equality? I wouldn't say so. You see, the pair of bishops are more or less like a perspective advantage. They can be used only when the time comes and when they can be connected with the power or the activity of the other pieces. At that point, black's development and his own pieces are so well controlling towards the center and towards the different areas of the board as well, that after putting up the rook on the c8 and getting ready to play rook c8 to c2, black will be really successful. Then he can move towards, let's say, rook after e8 or bishop e4 or d3, and in my opinion, he is a lot better. So if we have no development, if we have no support, the pair of bishops are pretty much nothing. White tried now to cover the c2 square, but then black simply used bishop c2. Of course, the idea is to force white to exchange, and then in case that recapture happens, black is going to turn his rook right in the second track. This will be amazing. You see, the dream of the rooks is to reach the open files, and the ecstasy is when they reach the second track. That's something amazing. And however, white cannot prevent it right now, because if he continues to follow just to play with one bishop, black is going to take the two open files, and trust me, that's not a position which I would love to play as white. Black will be having so many ways to create threats. Rook c2 will be under a threat. Now black, of course, threats to exchange and double white's pawns. If white takes rook takes c4, threatening d4 in the same time, and the bishop on f4. So white's problems are going to start, and in my opinion, he's going to experience quite big difficulties with his play. So after moving bishop a3, black decided to exchange on d1, rook f takes to d1, and now black came up with rook c8 to c2. The threat is now pointed against the b2 pawn. It seems that if white decides to do something like rook d2, just to cover the pawn, black's other rook is coming behind, and there are some similar threats that may follow. At that point, there could be a chance for black to consider exchanging the rooks on d2, c2 and d2. The other rook is going to follow at the c2 spot as well, and maybe even the black knight can jump over to e4. Who knows? It looks so powerful and so strong at the same time. Well, white exchanged on c2 at that point, and black simply recaptured. Rook c1, and then rook takes to c1, bishop takes c1. One of the things why I decided to show you this game is because of the endgame stage, and the endgame stage is really instructive. Right now we have bishop against knight. Most of the people know that bishop is slightly better than the knight, because no matter that they're both equal to 3 points, in general the bishop is a long-range piece. It can neutralize the activity or the different possibilities of the knight, and it can bring better results for the player who has that bishop, who owns it. Nevertheless, we have to know that the bishop is actually stronger than the knight, only when it has better prospects. It doesn't even depend so much on the position. The position might be opened or closed, but the bishop is always better when it has better prospects. If it has no better prospects, then the knight will be either equal or even somehow better than the bishop. What we see at this point is that most of the black pawns are put on light squares, which means that whatever white goes with this bishop, practically he can't attack on the black pawns. Then how can we say that this bishop has any prospects? How can the white bishop support any passed pawn or attack on the black pawns? How can he take a position from where it will be constantly putting pressure against black? I don't think that there is anything like that. And in result, when black simply considers bringing his pieces together, of course, we can see that white will be continuously having some problems with his pawn in the middle, like d4 and everything. Well, after the capture, bishop takes to c1. What black actually did in this position was knight back to d7. You see, the good thing of the knight is that it can jump from light to dark. In fact, it's not only light or dark square bishop as the bishop, dark squared as the bishop right now. And so black's main point is to bring the knight back to f8 and then come over the e6 square, attacking d4. There is nothing else for white but try to transfer the king in front. That's of course the key idea. In endgames, the king plays an important role. And now black starts promoting the pawns in the area where he feels that he'll be stronger. Look at the specific manner with which Fischer is realizing this endgame. First of all, he pushes the pawns carefully, and then second thing that he does is that he advances the king. The advancing of king and pushing the pawns in the right area are two of the most important things to be considered for a successful endgame. Right now, there is no way for white to hit on the black king, and by pushing the pawns forward, in fact, he's taking away white's major ways to play either g4 or to connect f4. So after g5, king f2, black played knight back to d8, and now of course, black has all the time in the world to wait, and most importantly, to maneuver the knight at a better perspective. After moving it on d8, it seems that white has the actual opportunity to bring bishop d2 and possibly take the control of the knight, but as we can see, black actually rules over. And here, black is utilizing the rule, don't hurry. If in the endgame we receive an advantage or a more perspective position, what we have to do is to go slowly. Because when going slowly, we can take our time until the opponent is thinking in order to find and even double check if we've already found our plans and consider how they are going to work. How are they going to make our position more successful? By playing f5, we see that the black's actual idea is to play f4, maybe consider playing king g6 at f5, and even g5 to g4. And when the white king came back on e2, black simply played f4, bishop f2, and knight g7. Now this knight will be turned, it will be actually transferred to f5, from where it will be putting sufficient pressure against d4. And after h3, knight f5, and king d3 as white played, black simply continued with pawn up to g4, straight. What's the point of that move? Well, I think that it's very easy to see it. After the pawn comes up to the g4 square, in general, black is going to get his free way for the king on g5. Then he might consider even playing g3, and by fixing the pawn, as I told you, the knight is more flexible. The bishop is good on the long diagonals. That's why I said when you have prospects, it's good. But right now, the white's light square, dark square bishop doesn't do anything so much. And so after the exchange, recaptures, f takes to g4, black finds the way to utilize the knight and actually capture the pawn. One of the most important things to remember about playing endgames is that we have to use all of our pieces. Not some of them, not just a few, but most of them. And by connecting, for example, like a king and a knight, plus pawn or something like that in front of the opponent's position, we can get a very successful type of approach for playing a certain endgame, like this one, for example. So after taking the pawn on g4, black was helpful. It was helpful for black to transfer his king up to the f5. And I guess black can consider moving the knight away, and then even the king can approach the g2 pawn. And so in result of bishop back to e1 and knight f6, of course we see that black's coordinated pieces are quite capable to create some literal problems in front of white. And after knight g3 check, king back to d3, king up to d3 and knight f5, we see that black's knight, king, and pawn are dominating to the white bishop. White decided to move with bishop f2 here and somehow stabilize, but that wasn't sufficient enough because black immediately came over with knight h4. Now there is the actual threat against the pawn on g2, and in reality, if white decides to capture h4, we can see that the king is going to take, and there is no way for white to probably stop black from capturing the g pawn and then advancing with the f3 to f2 and f1. Black's position is tremendously powerful. And so after moving up with knight h4, white decided to push up a5, but then black did knight x to g2, king c3, and then king f3. The king is now advancing, and further on, black is going to prepare f4, f3, and of course we see that white is completely out of job with his pieces. After the bishop came up, black played f3, bishop g3, Knight e3, of course, stabilizing. f2 can always happen. Now the actual idea is to torture white, and most importantly, win in the easier way. After the knight comes to f5, the bishop has nowhere to go, and of course after f4, f3 to f2, black is promoting the pawn. An amazing game with an extraordinary technique by the world champion Robert Fischer. I think that such games really give us the impression of how we should treat similar situations, and most importantly, how can we slightly improve our position by using the patterns that the grandmasters have already acquired.